Arthur Penn had been keeping a mason jar on the second shelf of his kitchen cabinet in Augusta, Georgia, for 18 months. Every Friday night after his overnight shift at the Augusta Regional Hospital, after he had mopped the same 12 corridors he had mopped for 26 years, after he drove home in the 2001 Buick with the driver's side window that only went down and never came back up, he opened the mason jar and put in whatever was left from the week. Some weeks it was $40. Some weeks it was $12. Once it was $120 because he'd skipped groceries and eaten from the hospital cafeteria's end of shift handouts. The jar had $2,140 in it when Arthur Penn walked onto the Family Feud stage in February 2023. His granddaughter Naomi needed a $47,000 spinal surgery that her parents' insurance had denied twice. Arthur had started the jar the month the second denial came in. He hadn't told Naomi's parents how much was in it. He had not done the math on how long it would take to get to $47,000. He was 70 years old. He mopped 12 corridors every night. He put in whatever was left. Steve Harvey found out about the jar in the middle of the game, and what he did next has never been done in 46 years of television. It was a Wednesday in February 2023, and Arthur Penn had come to Atlanta from Augusta with his daughter Beverly, his son-in-law Robert, his grandson Marcus, who was 17, and his church friend Clarence, who had been Arthur's closest friend for 31 years, and who had known about the mason jar for 8 of those 18 months. Clarence had offered to contribute to the jar. Arthur had said no. Clarence had offered again 3 more times over the following months. Arthur had said no each time. Clarence had decided to come on Family Feud with him instead, which was the closest he could get to helping. They had matching white shirts. Arthur had worn a tie over his. He believed in ties. Arthur was 70 years old. He had been the overnight janitor at Augusta Regional for 26 years. The same shift, the same corridors, the same cart of supplies that he knew by weight and by sound, and by exactly how the wheels hit the threshold between the elevator corridor and the medical wing. He had watched the hospital grow around him. He had watched 3 generations of nurses train and advance. He had watched the equipment update and the procedures change and the patients come and go. He had been in the particular invisible way of people who keep institutions running at the hours when no one is watching, the quiet constant of a place that couldn't have functioned without him, and wouldn't have recognized that if you'd asked. He had also, in those 26 years, raised his daughter Beverly in a single-parent household after his wife June passed in 1993. Beverly was now 38. She had married Robert, who worked in construction. They had 2 children, Marcus and Naomi. Naomi was 15. Naomi had been diagnosed at 13 with a spinal condition that had, over 2 years, progressed to the point where the neurologist had said, calmly, specifically, that without surgical intervention within the next 12 to 18 months, the nerve compression would cause permanent mobility limitation. The surgery existed. The surgeon existed. The hospital existed. The insurance company had looked at the case twice and used the word elective both times, which was a word that Arthur Penn, who had spent 26 years in hospitals watching the difference between elective on a form and necessary in a body, found to be the most dishonest word in the medical system. He had started the mason jar after the second denial. He had told himself he would figure it out. He had not done the math. He was a man of deep faith, and he had learned, over 70 years, that faith was not the absence of math, but sometimes the decision to act before the math made sense. Beverly and Robert had filed appeals. They had hired a patient advocate who who had given them a 40% chance. They had looked into payment plans that would require 12 years of payments and a level of debt that would reach into their retirement. Arthur had not told them about the jar. He had told himself it would be more useful as a surprise than as a discussion. He had $2,140 in it and $44,860 to go. But nobody in that studio knew about the mason jar on the second shelf. The game had been running for 14 minutes. Arthur Penn had been surprisingly good, sharper than the audience expected, quicker on the buzzer than a 70-year-old man in a tie tended to be. He'd made Steve laugh twice with answers that were both correct and funnier than the survey writers probably intended. The audience liked him immediately, the way audiences like people who are simply and completely themselves. And then came a question that changed everything. The survey question was, name something a grandparent does for a grandchild that parents can't do. The answers the survey expected were things like spoiling, telling stories, slipping money, giving second helpings. Arthur Penn's answer, given without hesitation, was, save up. Steve Harvey read it back. Save up. He looked at Arthur. Sir, tell me what you mean by that. Arthur looked at the podium for a moment. Then he looked at Steve. He told him about the mason jar. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey placed his cards on the podium. Slowly, he looked at Arthur Penn, a 70-year-old man in a white shirt and a tie who mopped hospital floors overnight and put the leftovers in a jar every Friday, and he said nothing for 8 seconds. How much is in the jar right now? Steve said. $2,140, Arthur said. He knew the exact number. He always knew the exact number. And the surgery costs $47,000, Arthur said. And the insurance denied it twice, Arthur said. They called it elective. Naomi can't fully, he stopped. He pressed his lips together. She's 15. She's in pain every day. The doctor says we have 12 months before the window closes. The room held its breath. Steve Harvey took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He stood for a moment. He stepped back from the podium. He walked to the edge of the stage. He stood with his back to the audience for 4 seconds. When he turned around, his eyes were wet, and his jaw was set in the way a jaw sets when something has been decided. Stop everything, he said. This game is over. He walked to Arthur Penn. Sir, he said. He stood in front of Arthur. I want to ask you something. Has Naomi ever heard you talk about the jar? No, Arthur said. I didn't want her to carry it. Does she know how serious the situation is? She knows, Arthur said quietly. Kids always know. I just didn't want her to know that I was worried. Steve nodded. Let me tell you something, he said. I grew up watching my parents carry things they didn't want us to see. My mother worked 2 jobs and smiled at dinner every night. I didn't know until I was grown what those 2 jobs cost her, and I promised myself, when I had the ability, that I would never let a parent spend their life carrying something that could be addressed, if only someone with the means to address it was paying attention. He looked at Arthur. I'm paying attention. He was not done. He pulled out his phone and called his foundation's medical emergency fund coordinator. He committed, live on the air, to covering the full $47,000 surgical cost for Naomi Penn. Every dollar. Immediately. No payment plan. No waiting. He also committed to engaging his legal team to file a formal appeal with the insurance company based on medical necessity documentation, not to get the money back, but to establish a precedent in Naomi's file that could protect her in any future coverage disputes. He called the hospital where the surgery was scheduled and left a message with the billing coordinator that payment authorization was coming within 72 hours. He set his phone down. He looked at the room. And Arthur, he said, the mason jar. I want you to take the $2,140 out of that jar on Friday. And I want you to take Naomi somewhere she wants to go. Not for the surgery. Just because. Just to go somewhere together. Arthur Penn pressed both hands to his face. His shoulders shook. He stayed that way for a moment. Clarence, his 31-year friend, who had offered 4 times and been told no, put both hands on Arthur's shoulder from behind and said nothing, because after 31 years Clarence understood when words weren't the right thing. Marcus, Arthur's 17-year-old grandson, was standing at the side of the stage. He walked onto the floor. He walked to his grandfather. He stood in front of him, this 17-year-old boy, and said, "Grandpa, nobody deserves this more than you." Nobody. Arthur Penn uncovered his face. He looked at his grandson. "I just put in what was left," he said. "Every week," Marcus said, "for 18 months. The studio fell completely silent, and then erupted in the way that only happens when a room has witnessed something that restores its faith in what humans are capable of being to each other. The competing family, the Harrison family from Savannah, had not moved from their podium during any of this. Their captain, a man named James, walked across the stage and extended his hand to Arthur Penn. He said, "Sir, you are the kind of man this country needs more of." Arthur shook his hand and said, "I'm just a grandfather doing what grandfathers do." James said, "No, sir. That's what makes you extraordinary." Steve announced both families were receiving the full prize packages. He then announced, to audible surprise, that the mason jar amount, $2,140, was being matched 10 times over by a personal contribution from his own account, and the full amount was going directly to Naomi and her family to use however they chose. Not for the surgery, which was covered. Just for them. The episode aired 9 weeks later. The clip of Arthur Penn saying "Save up" and what followed was viewed 240 million times in 14 days. The hashtag "The Mason Jar" trended globally. Insurance industry advocates cited the story in congressional testimony about denial practices. 3 major insurance companies were contacted by journalists asking about policies around pediatric spinal surgeries following the episode. 3 months after that Wednesday, Naomi Penn's surgery was scheduled. It was performed 5 months after the taping by the same surgeon who had originally recommended it. The surgery was successful. Her neurologist, in a follow-up appointment 2 months post-operation, told Beverly and Robert that the timing had been ideal. Any later, and the outcome would have been significantly less certain. Arthur Penn took Naomi to the Augusta Riverwalk the Friday after he opened the mason jar. They walked along the river for 2 hours. Naomi asked about the jar she'd heard from Marcus. Arthur told her about it. All of it. How much had been in it each week. What he'd skipped to make the Friday deposits. How he'd never done the math. Naomi held his hand while he talked. She didn't say anything until he finished. Then she said, "Grandpa, when I'm grown, I'm going to do that for you." Arthur Penn said, "Baby, you don't owe me anything." Naomi said, "I know. That's why I want to." A year after the taping, the Arthur Penn Grandparent Legacy Fund was established, funded by donations that had arrived from across the country in response to the episode, dedicated to providing emergency medical funding for families whose insurance has denied pediatric or adolescent medical procedures. Its motto, taken from Arthur's own words, "Put in what's left." Every week. Don't do the math. In its first year, the fund helped cover surgical costs for 19 families across 12 states. Today, Arthur Penn still mops 12 corridors at Augusta Regional on the overnight shift. He is 71 years old. He has slowed down a little, which his supervisors have accommodated because no one has any interest in losing a man who has been there for 26 years and still knows the exact weight of every cart. The mason jar is still on the second shelf of his kitchen cabinet. It is empty now. He leaves it there because he believes empty jars are how you remind yourself what full ones were for. Steve Harvey, in a later interview, said, "Arthur Penn taught me something. He taught me that faith isn't the absence of math. It's deciding to act before the math makes sense." He put $12 in a jar on the weeks when $12 was all he had. He didn't know how he'd get to $47,000. He just knew he had to start, and he trusted that the rest would show up. He paused. I was just the rest. Some love is stored in mason jars. Some love is counted out on Friday nights. Some love is $12 when $12 is all there is. Put in what's left. Every week. Don't do the math. The rest will show up. If this story about Arthur Penn and his mason jar moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the most powerful thing you can do is simply start, even when you can't see the finish line. Have you ever put in what you had, trusting it would be enough? Share your story in the comments and ring that notification bell. Because as Arthur Penn proved, sometimes the most extraordinary act is the smallest one, done every Friday with whatever's left.